Iran's supreme leader is dead, but the regime isn't. 2 minutes before the announcement, the Middle East was unstable. 2 minutes after, it was structurally altered. At 00, Fox News says it can confirm Iran's supreme leader is dead following Israeli strikes against his compound and location earlier today, and it attributes that confirmation to a senior Israeli official. That's not a rumor drifting across social media. That is an official claim delivered on camera. And here's the contradiction that destabilizes certainty. The broadcast frames this as a major blow at 0137, yet everything described around it suggests the system is designed to absorb exactly this kind of hit. A leader is removed, and the machine keeps moving. That tension is the story. Personalize the stakes for a second. While jets are striking 500 locations, sirens are sounding across Israel. At 0114, millions of people go into bomb shelters. That's families running down stairwells. That's people frozen in traffic. That's life turning into a countdown. And the takeaway at 0114 is repeated like a hammer. The Israelis have killed Iran's supreme leader. But here's the fracture in the story. At 0321, the reporter says a decision was made overnight by President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu to launch extensive strikes to neutralize that threat. Neutralize implies completion. Yet at 0626, we get the opposite. This isn't over. This is actually just beginning. Both cannot be true in the same way. So which reality are we actually entering? Now watch the evidence land. At 0053, a military official says the largest Israeli Air Force sortie against any country in the world was conducted with 200 Israeli fighter jets targeting 500 different locations, dropping hundreds of munitions. That scale isn't symbolic. That is saturation, and it sets a tone. This wasn't a whisper. This was force delivered at maximum speed. But look at the gap between words and actions. If the goal is neutralization, why does the broadcast also say this campaign is expected to continue in the days and possibly even weeks ahead at 0030? If this was a clean end, why prepare for a long continuation? That's where inevitability begins to form. And we haven't even reached the second consequence yet. Now the controlled reveal, we're given enough to feel the shape, but not enough to feel safe. The strikes, we're told at 0030, were focused on leadership for the Israelis, while military targets were initial for the Americans. That's two tracks, two objectives, coordinated in time, leadership and capability, not just punishment, architecture. Then the broadcast folds in the negotiation backdrop. At 0203, the reporter says the supreme leader was not a figurehead. He was the man in charge of decisions on the nuclear program and ballistic missile program. That's the frame. Remove the decision maker, remove the obstacle. But at 0233, there's another detail that changes how you read everything. Attempts made by the Trump administration, olive branches given, and negotiators sent to Oman and Switzerland. Names are stated: Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, described as working across the region around the clock over the past year, not only on this issue, but also Gaza and a new board of peace to create stability. A year of movement, then an overnight decision to strike. That sequencing matters. It suggests diplomacy wasn't absent. It was attempted, then replaced by force. And that leads to a destabilizing question. If diplomacy was on the table, why choose decapitation now? Was this about ending a threat or forcing a different kind of outcome? But here's the fracture in the story. While the off-ramp is being mentioned, the battlefield is expanding. At 0346, we hear Iran's response includes ballistic missile fire targeting major population centers: Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa. And it's not only Israel. The reporter lists Bahrain, the UAE, and Qatar. And at 0406, a regional diplomat says 8 people were injured in Qatar and 1 in critical condition. That's not contained. That's regional. Now the pattern becomes visible. Diplomacy attempted, rejected according to the framing, force deployed, leader eliminated, regional retaliation triggered. And then astonishingly, at 0713, President Trump tells Axios he believes he has several off-ramps and that it could end in 2 or 3 days. 2 or 3 days after the supreme leader is killed, either that's extraordinary confidence or extraordinary risk. And this is where control starts slipping, because compressed timelines create miscalculation. Now we deliver the first evidence strike, and we don't let it float without anchor. The strong analytical claim is this: killing a leader can be decisive, but it can also be catalytic. The evidence is in the broadcast itself. At 0203, the Supreme Leader is framed as the central decision node for nuclear and missile policy. That's the rationale. But within minutes, the consequences show up as ballistic missiles across multiple countries, with injuries reported in Qatar at 0406. The action triggers reaction, and reaction widens the field. Now translate what that detail means. If missiles are already reaching beyond Israel, then the conflict is no longer a bilateral exchange. It's pulling the Gulf into defensive and offensive posture. And at 0650, we literally hear a source familiar to Fox News saying some Gulf partners are responding to Iran defensively and offensively. That is a major structural shift described in one sentence. Notice what's absent. There is no confirmation of regime collapse, no report of Tehran fracturing publicly, no statement that the system is falling apart. Instead, at 0626, the report says the Supreme Leader reportedly had already prepared successors, and the IRGC had already prepared successors for the top commanders. That implies contingency planning. That implies expectation. That implies the machine was designed to keep running even if the top is removed. But here's the fracture. If successors were prepared, then the strike doesn't dissolve authority. It triggers succession under fire, and succession under fire changes behavior. It could produce restraint to stabilize, or it could produce escalation to prove strength. Either way, the risk curve rises. Now we hit the normalization shift, where something abnormal becomes routine. At 0517, the report recalls Israel's earlier decapitation strike. They killed Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah in a strike in the Dhaka neighborhood of southern Beirut, and the reporter describes the method: going after missile launching positions, moving field by field and cave by cave, targeting positions dug into mountainsides. That's not emotional language. That's operational description. Now compare it to 00 Ping 53, 200 fighter jets, 500 locations, hundreds of munitions. The scale has expanded, but the doctrine is consistent. Leadership removal is becoming a tool, not an exception. And once it's a tool, the psychological threshold changes. The question becomes not, would they do it, but when do they do it again? And this is where the story stops being isolated, because the broadcast immediately ties leadership removal to the proxy network. At 0453, Iran's largest proxies are named Hezbollah and the Houthis. An intelligence official is referenced saying Hezbollah still has thousands of rockets and missiles, and around half of them are within range of Israeli cities. That's a concrete detail. Thousands. Half within range. Cities at risk. Now the pivot: watch what they never addressed. They never say Hezbollah is neutralized. They say it's degraded, but it still poses a threat at 0517 and 06 Mahor. And then we're told Hezbollah has said that if Iran's supreme leader was targeted, they would get directly involved in this war at 06 Sao. So the abnormal becomes routine. Decapitation strikes, multi-front proxy threats, missiles on cities, Gulf injuries, and yet conversations about off-ramps happening in parallel. This isn't calm. This is systems operating at high speed. Now we hit evidence strike number 2, heavier than the first, and we expose contradiction between stated position and observable action. At 0233, the broadcast says the Trump administration was initially willing to ignore Iran's ballistic missile program, support of regional proxies, and crack down on protesters to get an agreement together on the nuclear program. That's a stated willingness to narrow the deal. But what happens next in the story is ballistic missile fire across major cities and Gulf states, and the very lever they were willing to ignore becomes the lever Iran uses under pressure. The contradiction is visible. The missile program is not a side issue when missiles are hitting Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa at 0346 and injuring people in Qatar at 0406. Now the line that permanently reframes the issue: the strike didn't eliminate conflict dynamics, it compressed them. It turned negotiation, retaliation, and regional alignment into simultaneous processes. Force, response, and diplomacy are now overlapping. And here's the fracture in the story. The broadcast references June 2025's 12-day war at Sor 942, with more than 24 people killed in Israel amid heavy incoming ballistic missile fire. The reporter says Israel was striking Iran's air defenses, and then President Trump ordered Operation Midnight Hammer, after which Iran responded just once against a base in Qatar and then backed off. The implication is that overwhelming force can create a pause. But a pause is not a resolution. It's a recalibration. Now we enter the pressure cascade, stack developments, increase tempo, emphasize momentum. The campaign is expected to continue for days or weeks at 0030. Israel expects air superiority by tomorrow at 0346. Iran is already firing ballistic missiles at major cities and across the Gulf at 0346 and 0406. Hezbollah still has thousands of rockets at 0453 and has warned it could enter directly if the supreme leader is targeted at 060. Gulf partners are responding defensively and offensively at 0650. That's not one crisis. That's multiple triggers aligned. Now the pivot, now the pattern becomes visible. Once air superiority is achieved, sustained strikes become easier. Sustained strikes pressure infrastructure and command nodes. Pressure forces regimes into binary decisions, escalate to deter or negotiate to survive. And the broadcast frames the regime as weakened at 0906, different from 2.5 years ago, with proxies decimated and limited options. But weakened does not mean harmless. It can mean reactive. It can mean cornered. And at 0924, the reporter calls it a cornered regime, citing the crackdown and limited options. Cornered systems make sharp decisions. They do not wait for perfect conditions. What happens if this doesn't slow down? Now we do the personal collision. We shift perspective to you, without ideology, without rant. When sirens send millions of people into bomb shelters at 0114, that's not a political concept. That's a human one. When missiles target Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa at 0346, that's not theory. That's daily life zones becoming impact zones. And when 8 people were injured in Qatar at 0406, with one critical, that's a reminder that regional escalation crosses borders faster than headlines can keep up. And you don't need to live there to feel it. The broadcast explicitly mentions anti-ship missiles at 0817, shipping lanes, energy routes, insurance, airline reroutes. Those are the connective tissues of daily life elsewhere. Even without adding outside facts, the mechanism is clear. When multi-state conflict grows, systems strain, prices move, risk premiums rise, plans change. This is where control starts slipping, not because someone is screaming, but because decisions are being made in compressed time windows. Off-ramps are being discussed at 0713 while missiles are still flying. That means the margin for error is thin. If this feels close to home, say that in the comments. Now we step above the event for the system reveal. The doctrine, leadership decapitation as leverage, the structure, a theocracy with succession planning, the broadcast itself gives both. At 00, confirmation of the kill. At 0626, confirmation that successors were prepared, including IRGC commanders. Here's the calm but unsettling insight. The strike is not only about removing a person, it's about testing whether the system breaks, tightens, or adapts under maximum pressure. If the system fractures, you get instability. If it tightens, you get escalation capacity under new leadership. If it adapts, you get a faster, harder version of the same machine. And the broadcast keeps feeding you the same dual reality. Neutralize the threat at 0321, but this is just beginning at 0626. Those two statements are the lock and the key. One is the intent, one is the consequence. Now we open the trajectory window, two plausible paths, no certainty. Path 1 is compression. The president says this could end in 2 or 3 days at 0713 with off-ramps. If air superiority is achieved quickly at 0346, and if missile launch capacity is degraded, and if proxies hesitate to expand the front, then a short, violent recalibration becomes plausible. In that path, diplomacy returns not as friendship, but as constraint management. Path 2 is compounding. Hezbollah still has thousands of rockets within range of cities at 0453 and has signaled it could enter directly if the supreme leader is targeted at 0600. Gulf partners are already shifting posture at 0650. Iran still has ballistic missiles and anti-ship missiles at 0817. If those levers are pulled faster than they can be neutralized, and if casualties expand, then duration grows. Days become weeks, exactly as framed at 0030. The next move is already forming, not in speeches, in command centers, in the choice to widen or narrow targets, in the choice to activate proxies or hold them back, in the choice to treat the strike as leverage or as existential threat. Now the reframe and loop, one sharp insight, one sentence that changes how you see it, and we open the next video. One man is gone, but the machine is still moving. At 0:53, 200 jets hit 500 locations. At 03:46, missiles hit major cities. At 04:06, injuries are reported in Qatar. At 06:26, successors are already prepared. At 07:13, off-ramps are already being discussed. And at 00:30, the campaign is expected to continue for days, possibly weeks. So here's the reframing sentence. This wasn't the end of a threat. It was the moment thresholds were rewritten. If leadership decapitation becomes normalized doctrine, then deterrence itself changes shape. And the next conflict won't start where the last one started. It will start at the new threshold. Subscribe if you want the next phase dissected the moment it moves, because this story didn't close tonight. It accelerated.